2014 F-150, 4-wheel drive, 7 lug. All right, let's get right down to it. This is how far I've gotten so far. Took the nut off the ball joint, zipped it off. If you got a small impact like that one, little stubby one, you can zip it off that way. If your ball joint just keeps spinning, you can put a wrench, preferably a ratcheting wrench, on the nut. And I believe that was 18 millimeter. And then you can put a socket on this square piece to keep it from spinning and get it loosened that way. Same story on tie rod end, sway bar link, if you got to take those off. This is a special case. It has a leveling kit up there. So it makes it a lot trickier. There's a lot more pressure. So we're doing the control arm and ball joint, but you've got these bolts up in there that the control arm attaches to, and they'll just hit the back of that strut. So we got to get that strut out of the way. Normally I would just loosen everything and pull this forward, but with the leveling kit, we got no room. I already got the nuts off the top of the strut. Those were 15 millimeter, I believe, or were they 17? Well, anyways, it's not stock. It's got the leveling kit. And one of them I had to torch off because it just kept spinning. Torch the nut off of it. Hurt the threads a little bit. I'm going to have to replace that. And we've got, I think I got a 13/16 on this. It should be actually a 21. Same story with the tie rod end. I put a 22 on there. It's actually a 21, a little sloppy. So normally I wouldn't take the sway bar link off or the tie rod off, but with this leveling kit, I can't get to the strut. I can't get it down enough to get the strut out of the way. Plus I gotta replace that stud up top. I've got these big bolts loosened up. They allow the big control arm to slide down more to get the strut out of the way. I use these wrenches. A little sloppy, the 1 1/16, but fit on there good. Then I attach that wrench to it to break it free. My big breaker bar there, it won't fit the 1 1/16 inside of it. So I just doubled up the wrenches. It was a little tough, but I got them break free. You might need to use torches, impact, whatever you gotta do. All right, so now it's time to get the strut out of the way so I can fix that stud up top and get to the bolts for the control arm. So to get this strut out of the way easily, I gotta at the very least take this tie rod off, which it comes off easy. Zipping it off with my impact, and then I'm gonna hammer right here on this flat spot really hard with my heavy hammer, and the tie rod's gonna pop out of there. All right, tie rod's off there. I just kept the nut on there, put it back on so I don't lose track. A lot of these nuts are similar. Heated up my sway bar link nut. You can use the old trick of putting a socket on the tip and spin it with a ratcheting wrench or a wrench. I just heated it up with the vice grips around there so it doesn't spin. Easiest way to take it off. Got my brake hose off, 10 millimeter, gives it a little more slack. Right now our vacuum line is real tight. I'm gonna take that off. All right, and we're pretty sloppy here. I'm gonna go ahead and use my jack with a block of wood. Bring this control arm back up to tight. I'm gonna get these, looks like I need more room with the leveling kit. So I'm gonna get these press-in studs knocked out. I'm putting the nut on so that the stud is flush with the nut, and I'm gonna hammer upwards, and you'll see there's press marks in these studs, and you can put them back in afterwards. So I'm gonna take those studs out to get me more room to pull this strut out. Here's our press studs broken apart here. You can see there's little press lines on them. When we go to put these in, we'll just give them a little hammer whack and then tighten them up from the bottom. That'll put those presses back in. Now everything's taken apart. Sway bar link, tie rod, take those studs out, and I will lower my jack, and if I have to, I'll put a little crowbar or pry bar right in between here to bring it down, bring the whole control arm down so I can get that strut out of there. All right, there's our strut out. I did have to pry down just a little bit. I sprayed down some PB Blaster. It's important on these, especially if you're like in the salt belt like me. Wire wheel all these threads above the nuts, spray them down, whatever, so that everything comes apart nicely. So I'm going to show you what this leveling kit's all about. I had to torch a nut off of there. I tried not to hurt the threads, but I went too far on this side. I torched it 3 points and chiseled the remains of the nut off, but I went a little too far with my torch right there. So I got to replace this stud. I believe those are 15 millimeter at the top. They zip off. It's safe to zip off. This is just the leveling block. Then you got your regular mount below it. So we're going to zip that off and replace this stud. I got the plate off the leveling kit right there. There's the one I torched. You can see it melted the rubber. And you can see these ones are about to start spinning too. So when we go to put this back on, before we do that, we're going to clean up those studs really good. Make sure they spin on real smooth so those don't start spinning. So we got this guy. We're going to pound that out, find a replacement bolt to put in it. Maybe one size bigger so it's tight. That's how we're going to replace that. Then we're going to zip this back on the top of the strut in the same position. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to get this control arm with ball joint out. The whole reason why we're here. I got a ratcheting wrench here. On the passenger side, you can actually use a ratchet from the inside. On the other side, you can't use a ratchet towards at least the front because it hits on something. So a ratcheting wrench is best for this. That's 13/16. I think it's actually a 21. 13/16. I don't have a 21 ratcheting wrench. I do got 13/16 that fits on there tight. So I'm going to get this control arm out of there too. Alright, we got another side note. I moved this vacuum hose way out of the way because it was hitting on the wrench. I don't want to hurt those vacuum hoses. They're prone to crackage. And you got to have a 7/8 wrench over on this side because that'll start spinning. I already got that side out. And then when you go to put your new one in, there's no alignment, shims, or anything. So you just put the new one straight in. Left and right are different. So make sure you put the right one on. Match them up. So I'm going to get the new one put in. We got our new bolt in there. You can see this one's a little taller, no threads going all the way down. There's nothing that's going to hit on up here, so we might have to put some washers there. I don't know how thick that plate is, but I think I'm going to have to put a few washers on there. It'll be fine. See, I needed a hex-in bolt like this, and I've got bolts everywhere, and I could not find one. That was the best I could find. I didn't feel like going to a hardware store or something. That'll work just fine. We got a new control arm in. I don't have these nuts all the way tight yet, just got it in. As we're putting the strut in, we're gonna have to lift up on this control arm, you know, because it gets in the way. So let's get that strut put back up in there because we can tighten these bolts with the strut in there. We can fit a 7/8 on that end and tighten it from this side. Now it's time for the strut. As I'm putting it in there, I might have to have a helper pry down on this. I could do it by myself. It's easier with a helper. Just so I can fit that strut into the slots. We got our strut up in there. It's not fun to do by myself. It's heavy. So while you're lifting it, lining up the stud holes at the top, you gotta lift up on this, get the tie rod out of your way, pull down on the lower control arm and stick it in there. Not fun. Alright, so we got our grease cert in the ball joint. It was a little 8mm grease cert. We can grease that after we got everything put back together but the tire. We're going to put all our vacuum hoses, brake hose, and everything back where they go. Tighten up those real nice and tight. Get our tie rod back on there if it starts spinning. Use the old trick with the socketed end and a wrench. Put our sway bar nut back on. Remember, we got to tighten these guys back up, and on those guys they can slide. You see where the nut was? That's your alignment. So we need to put that back where it was. So we're going to put that nut back where it was so the alignment's not crazy off. This will get alignment afterwards. So we're at the point where it's just all tightening everything back up. Nuts on the top of the strut. And then once everything's tight, grease that ball joint. And that'll do it. So I'm gonna leave this loose while I connect the lower ball joint, because if you tighten it up, then you've got resistance, it's tougher. If you tighten that up all the way first, you might have to use a jack with a chunk of wood, or let the vehicle down, jack up on this control arm so you can get that upper ball joint to fit through the slot of the steering knuckle. Check your specs. Make sure you got your tie rod, ball joint, all that stuff, torque to spec. Put your cotter key and your castle nuts that you have anywhere. And that'll wrap this job up.